What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Ghost of Tsushima, an open-world action-adventure taking place, of course, in Japan during an invasion by the Mongol Empire. But before we get into all that, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a video linked below that covers everything I go over, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. Now, in the case of this particular title, while it did in fact release a few years ago, it only came to PC very recently, and this is a PC channel, so we're going to focus a little bit on that, which very unsurprisingly means I did not get a review copy from Sony, of course. As this is a PC channel, I pretty much never talk to them, so I did in fact buy this one. But let's talk a bit more specifically about the game. We take on the role of Jin Sakai, a samurai and the close nephew of the island's local ruler known as a Jito. Like the other samurai on the island, as a response to the Mongol invasion, you fight the enemy head-on, but it's pretty much a losing battle. So when the samurai forces are defeated, with you only barely surviving, we take the fight to the Mongols in what is essentially guerrilla warfare, which is our setup for a pretty moving plot revolving around honor and commitment to one's ideals. But all of that is told through the medium of an open-world action-adventure that is, while very unique in its approach to some of those traditional mechanics, is at the same time a pretty traditional open world, all things considered. Throw in a fun combat system and we've got a fair bit to talk about. So let's dive into this a little further, starting with, of course, the technical state of the game. How is this thing running, and specifically on PC, more importantly perhaps? And I'm happy to say that by and large, this is a pretty good PC port. Now, in terms of crashing, I didn't really experience anything like that. Outside of what was directly related to my own video recording software, the game didn't seem to play nice with that, but that's obviously more of a content creator problem than a general one, because when I wasn't recording, the game ran perfectly. Outside of a few stutters here and there if I played the game for a very long time. But there are still a handful of other issues. For starters, I would occasionally get a pretty uncommon bug where during the game's standoffs, when you could challenge a group of enemies to a one-on-one fight to kick it off, you're supposed to hold down a button, and sometimes that just doesn't work, forcing you to be hit at the beginning of this, which obviously isn't great. And what's more, while I personally didn't experience too many major issues, I have seen reports of people on Steam talking about crashes and a couple of the issues I've mentioned here. So I wouldn't say it's all sunshine and rainbows there, but I think a patch aimed at specifically those issues would clear it up, or at least has the potential to, so something to keep in mind for sure. And very much so specific to the PC release, I was very curious how the PC port would be handled in terms of its keyboard and mouse controls, because I personally, as someone who plays pretty much only on PC, prefer to play purely with a keyboard and mouse and the occasional thing like a custom keypad. And I'm happy to say that they did a really good job here with all of the keys being fully rebindable, with no issues picking up things like peripherals, so all good on that front. And given how porting previous console exclusives is pretty hit or miss in that specific regard, I'm happy to see that they did a good job there. But moving on a little bit, let's talk about the PlayStation Network and the multiplayer mode of this game, because it's, of course, a somewhat unavoidable topic when speaking about this, especially since if you buy the game on Steam, there's a big disclaimer right near the buy button that explains that you need a PlayStation Network account to utilize the game's online mode. And of course, everything that goes with that, like the PlayStation overlay. So it's important to mention that you can play the entirety of the single-player experience without touching this at all. The only thing you are required to make that account for is if you choose to play the game's online Legends mode. Now, I do think it's unfortunate that they added a bunch of multiplayer achievements associated with this, and Steam does not function the same way PlayStation does, where the platinum for the base game is separate from like the DLC. On Steam, it's just a flat raw percentage for how much you have on the game. So a meaningless detail to most, I'm sure, but just something to note. And honestly, I just hate multiplayer achievements in general, because at some point, if those servers get shut down, now you've got things about this game that can't be completed anymore, which is something I've seen happen in the past. But more to the point, a big issue with this PlayStation Network requirement is that because this exists, this particular game is not available in countries where the PlayStation Network is not available, which is something like about 180 of them, which certainly kind of sucks, but all in all, the practice of requiring a third-party account or even a launcher from games on Steam isn't unheard of. But in this particular case, I think it's noteworthy that the game was initially available to pre-order in all of those countries before a decision came down about the PlayStation Network requirement just a few weeks or so before this game launched, which is obviously pretty bad timing for communication and forced them to refund a bunch of those pre-orders. So while I don't think the practice is necessarily that egregious, seeing as it's honestly a pretty common practice overall, their communication around it was pretty horrible. But with that said, let's talk about the multiplayer mode. If you need a PlayStation Network account to access this, is it actually any good? And honestly, overall, it just seems mostly fine. I don't hate it, but it feels a little tacked on given that the primary game is a single-player, story-driven experience, and then now suddenly you have this multiplayer mode that splits up the basics of your class mechanics in the game to 4 different classes, each with their sort of own tiered loot progression that you can use, which upgrades your character's power level, which changes what missions you can tackle in the game's story mode, which is generally a 2-player experience across 9 chapters, and then later on, there's even a big raid you can take part in. But while I think they did a pretty good job with the multiplayer overall, given that it's just a very mission-oriented thing where you can't even play the bulk of the content from the base game, to me the multiplayer just feels a bit tacked on. Moving right along and switching back to specifically the single-player experience, let's talk about difficulty in New Game Plus a little bit. So the game does come with a variety of difficulties that I actually enjoyed messing around with quite a bit. Though basically it's your standard easy, normal, hard, and then finally lethal. Now, story is obviously very easy. Medium, I would say, starts out fairly impactful with you getting extremely overpowered by the end. And hard, of course, requiring you to understand and utilize a bit more of the game's mechanics, such as the combat stances against specific enemy types that we'll talk about. But then there's lethal, probably the most noteworthy overall, because lethal doesn't just make enemies harder to deal with, but rather it significantly increases the damage of both you and the enemies, meaning that both you and the enemies will die in basically 1 or 2 hits to essentially anything. So it's a sort of high-risk, high-reward mode that obviously prioritizes strategy and understanding the game's mechanics and able to move through encounters without getting hit at all, ideally, which can make for some really excellent moments with the game's, I would say, very visceral feeling combat. Personally, though, I didn't enjoy playing with lethal turned on all the time, mostly because the game's combat camera in certain instances is not great, and it doesn't feel awesome to die to a few cheap shots that you quite literally never saw coming because of the way the camera moves in tight spaces. So while it was fun every once in a while, I mostly stuck to hard or medium. Then there is New Game Plus mode. So after you beat the game's story, you can start up New Game Plus, which throws you into the game at the moment that you've completed the initial prologue and thus can run through all the content again with all your accumulated knowledge and progression. It also unlocks a few special things, such as the New Game Plus vendor that offers a variety of extra cosmetics and other cool items that can be really fun to mess around with and simply enjoy. So if you're having a blast and want to run through New Game Plus, I think there's a decent enough reason to do so. But that finally brings us to the story of this game. Now, in my opinion, the best thing that Ghost of Tsushima has going for it is its story. It's honestly incredible. So I'm going to give a little bit of a basic setup here, and then I'll avoid the rest simply for the sake of spoilers for the people playing through it the first time on PC like myself did. But as I mentioned in the overview, this game takes place during the Mongol invasion of Japan during the 13th century, and historically they did in fact attack the island of Tsushima on Komoda Beach, where 80 samurai attacked a force of roughly 8,000 Mongols and were unsurprisingly defeated. That part is where the historical accuracy of this game largely ends, however, with the rest of it pretty much being works of fiction, both in terms of its characters and events. So in many ways it's a sort of alt history title. Now in particular though, we take on the role of Jin Sakai, nephew to Lord Shimura, the island's local leader known as Ajito, and both of them charged headlong into battle with the Mongols, only for Lord Shimura to be captured, and our character to come within moments of death on the beach, only to be pulled to safety and nursed back to health by a thief named Yuna who wants your help tracking down her brother. So that's the opening scene, basically. But where it gets really, really impactful is the fact that as a samurai with their code of honor, Jin Sakai is conflicted between doing what it takes to confront the Mongols via guerrilla warfare and doing everything in his power to save the people of the island, which is important to Jin's own personal idea of honor, which comes into conflict with the samurai code of honor, which is a pretty demanding approach to essentially frontal assaults that quite clearly aren't going to win against overwhelming numbers, especially when the enemy is following no such scruples. And while that's about as much as I want to describe of the story, I will say that from start to finish, it was just incredible. I really loved the story of this game. The ending was honestly pretty much exactly what I thought it was going to be about halfway through the game. I thought to myself, I'm pretty sure I know how this is going to wind up ending. And even with that knowledge and assumption of what was going to happen, it was still a very emotional ending to the game that actually leaves you with a choice that technically leads to one of two endings, but it was incredibly moving stuff either way. And in my experience, the story was by far the best part of it. But from there, I want to talk a little bit about progression systems available to us. And given that it is an action adventure, they're not too overly complicated, but there is a fair bit to know. So for starters, as you complete missions and defeat groups of enemies, you'll gain sort of fame through the game's legend system. As you complete more and more of these activities, your legend as the Ghost of Tsushima grows, and as it does, you'll earn technique points, and you can also occasionally earn them as rewards from particular missions and the like. These points can be spent on various abilities that are of course going to improve your character, and they relate to exploration, such as pointing you to specific places, combat abilities, increasing your usefulness with certain combat stances, etc. So all of these abilities that you can pick up via your technique points are going to be available to you at the end of the game. You won't have a problem obtaining them all. There's enough technique points to get everything. But it's worth a mention that some of the abilities that you'll get from the technique points themselves are actually locked off behind certain story moments, meaning that you'll need to complete certain missions before you can do them. And then there's other more specific stuff, like you'll get access to what are called ghost weapons, which are for the most part throwables, and you'll get some of these as your legend grows, whereas your various samurai stances become more and more available as you start killing off leaders of Mongol camps, and then you can put the technique points into them as an example. Now, another big form of progression is your gear and the upgrades to that gear. So right away, certain missions will usually grant you access to certain armor sets, such as the initial main story missions that grant you your basic samurai clan armor, but there's also a lot of others you can find, including some optional mythic stuff, where you'll hear the tale of an ancient legend of sorts around the island that you can chase down, which usually leads to a specific set of armor. Now, each armor set, outside of the basic starter one, has a set of variables, usually 2 or 3, that increase or change what your character does in some way. This includes things like simply reducing enemy damage, massively increasing your own health, making it easier to stagger enemies, etc. So the specifics of what armor you're wearing are actually pretty important, but both your armor and your weapons can actually be upgraded as you gather up materials and bring them to vendors within certain town hub areas. The game is going to allow you to pick up just a generic supply item and then other more specific things like iron, steel, bamboo, etc. And you can bring all of that back to vendors for your sword, your bows, your armor, and upgrade those pieces accordingly. Now for your armor, it actually upgrades visually as well as you go, which is important because while your main piece of armor is stat-based, your face and head items are actually just cosmetic and can be swapped out to mix and match how you want, which I thought was neat. And of course, simply upgrading your weapons makes them more effective. Now for your Tanto, this basically means you can assassinate more quietly and faster, whereas for your sword, it just deals more damage along with your bows that you'll eventually get access to. Now, beyond that stuff, there is a handful of, I would say, open world activities that can grant you progression as well, such as, for instance, the hot springs you can find throughout the area will upgrade your maximum health alongside a couple other mechanics doing this. And then there are these bamboo things you can practice on to slice through a bunch of bamboo at once with your katana, and successfully completing those allows you to upgrade your resolve. Resolve being what you're going to be using to activate special abilities, including some mythic abilities you can get from those legends I mentioned. So all in all, I would say there's a fair few progression systems, and to the game's credit, it does feel like you're always unlocking something, earning new ways to play and go about the game's ultimate combat loop alongside its exploration. So while it's not as deep as something like a CRPG, there was enough to mess around with here and sort of come up with builds and stacking things like armor, charms, and even just the weapons like kunai or sticky bombs that you might want to use to come up with a fun way to play, or just the simple act of taking enemies head on or sticking to the shadows, but you're likely going to have a bit of a mix between those two options. Now, the last thing I want to mention on progression, though, is the charm system. So as you find the little fox shrines out in the world, which we'll get to, you can unlock charm slots on your katana, which will allow you to, of course, slot in the charms that you'll have found, of which you can equip 2 major ones, and I believe off the top of my head 4 minor ones. And these also have big impacts on your gameplay and specifically combat, of course, that can ultimately change how you approach things, and in combination with your armor and the like, effectively creates what your character's build is, though these can be pretty much freely swapped out whenever, so you can absolutely adjust on the fly. Now, I will say there were way too many charms in my opinion. Some of them were very niche, and they also give you duplicates all the time, and oftentimes getting those felt more like clutter than a substantial upgrade, especially since you're likely to find out how you want to utilize those relatively quickly, which can make sorting through them a bit of a headache. But it's not a huge deal, mind you. But that brings us to the other big part of this game, which is the, of course, gameplay and world, as this is an open world action adventure after all, so let's talk about that a little bit. First up, we have the island of Tsushima itself, which is divided up into 3 areas. Now, each chapter of the game is going to give you access to the next area, so it is a little bit gated off based on what you've done story-wise, but each area of the game is a large open world section with its sort of own theme and elements to go around and find. Now, one thing I really like about this game is the novel way it approaches, I would say, very traditional open world systems. You see, ultimately, this title has that sort of checklist open world where you go to specific points of interest, do the activity, get the reward, and then leave. And while there are little bits of exploration where you can go just find something and discover perhaps a cosmetic item there, mechanically speaking, there's not really much more to it than that. But something that this title does really well that I think adds to the game very much so is both its sense of atmosphere and really getting into the spirit of what the culture is supposed to be and represent, alongside simply gorgeous environments, really helps sell the feeling of the world, even if it is very traditional in its structure. And what's more, to really drive that home, they've also implemented this guiding wind mechanic, as well as the ability to follow certain visual cues out in the open world that can lead you to things without you ever actually opening the map to take a look at all those checklist activities you'll be doing. And while there certainly is some of that, their ability to utilize the mechanics of the world you are actually looking at to sort of naturally guide you to those things can help take away from that feeling of a traditional open world, which I really enjoyed. Some of what I mean by this is that the game utilizes a guiding wind, as it calls it, which is actually tied into the game's story as well, being a bit of a metaphor for Jin's past and his parents pushing him forward, that kind of thing. But functionally speaking, the wind in the game actually blows in the direction of your current objective, and you can gust this wind to make it more obvious, but also there's just a lot of leaves and things being blown around in the world as you walk around, and if you're paying attention to the way that's pointing, it will point you to where you need to go. But that's just for your objectives. The game also does a lot of cool things visually with the things you can discover out in the world, such as the fox dens. These are always highlighted visually by a big golden tree that stands out and has a fox den underneath it, and if you follow the fox from that, it'll lead you to an Inari shrine, which is going to help you upgrade at first the number of charm slots you have and then the actual power of those charms. If you want to find a hot spring, you can look for the large cluster of red trees that usually surround them. You can also occasionally find golden birds flying overhead that will actually then guide you to specific things, even things things that aren't marked on the map, which happened a few times, such as little hidden vanity items, such as a different type of helmet, but they can also lead you to just the actual points of interest as well, which includes things like spots where you can compose a haiku. These are actually also marked, in my experience, by a sort of large flock of birds above them, but if you go to these points, you can reflect on nature and compose a haiku, which, while also very culturally relevant to Japan, grants you a specific vanity item for you to use as well, such as a headband that actually shows you the haiku that you wrote in the menu where you select it. So there's a lot of little stuff like that the game nails with the intention of drawing you into the world and distracting from the, I would say, more run-of-the-mill approaches. But the downside to this is if you're actually exploring and doing absolutely everything, as opposed to just sort of going with the flow or simply being pushed around by the wind, as it were, you're likely to quickly notice that a lot of that is simply a veneer for the game's mechanics, but it is nonetheless really cool, and I think it actually does succeed at what it is trying to do, which is to get you to focus less on the mechanical certainty of those things and simply enjoy the incredible atmosphere and vistas the game has to show you. And for me, that was enough to make up for things I've seen in 100 other games, let's be honest. And while I've mentioned a great deal of those mechanics in one form or another already, something I did want to call out in particular is, I would say, just a tiny thing that subverted my own expectations, which I thought was funny. You see, the game does have a fog of war on the map as you move around, and you'll occasionally find these lighthouses. Now, my initial instinct when I saw these is I was going to go, oh, I'll go light the lighthouse, and then that will reveal the map around it, and that's where all the points of interest are, and that's how that works. But that's actually not true at all. Lighting the lighthouses does not do that. In fact, what reveals small portions of the map is clearing enemy Mongol camps, liberating them from occupation, and that specifically will reveal a small area of the map around that specific camp. And then, if you go liberate every single camp in that particular section of the map, which is again divided into 3 different distinct areas, but this will require you to also handle the story, as there are a few main camps that are designated as part of the story that have to be dealt with. Then once all of them are cleared, it will reveal that area's map entirely, and you can go sort of mop up anything you might have missed. And that was a small tweak on the formula that I actually enjoyed quite a bit. I think that was better than the lighthouse thing I was expecting, and I was happy to see that subtle difference. So all in all, for the actual world and gameplay of the title, it is technically speaking rooted in very traditional approaches to those things, but I think it also does a wonderful job of covering them up and getting you to focus more on the world itself and exploring it than looking at a map and engaging directly with the mechanical portion of it, which makes it more engaging than I was initially expecting it to be. And it was just a really cool way to go about that, and I liked it quite a bit. But that brings us to the combat side of things, which is an interesting thing for this title because it encompasses a lot of different approaches to things, including the story nuance between Jin's approach to taking the fight to the Mongols via effectively guerrilla warfare, or even effectively just being an assassin as well, and how that conflicts with his samurai code of honor, which leads to things like one-on-one duels and standoffs with the enemy. And all throughout, both in terms of stealth and direct confrontation, the game feels like it has a ton of impact to the combat, regardless of the difficulty you're on. Now, I would say late game, especially even on normal, it gets to a point where you have so much health and things going for you that it can feel a little nonsensical, but the early game of the lower difficulties, and of course all throughout on the harder ones, the game feels like it has impactful combat, and I enjoyed messing around with that a lot. Now, I've already talked a little bit about the standoff system and how this can occasionally be bugged out to essentially force you to lose. You can nonetheless, when encountering a group of enemies, initiate a standoff, which starts with a one-on-one match where you hold a button and then release it when that enemy attacks, though they'll try to fake you out here and there. And doing this will effectively one-shot them. Later on, there's a set of armor and a skill you can upgrade that allows you to take out like 5 enemies at once with this. And considering that that's about the group size of many of the encounters you'll meet on the road, is a nice way to just one-shot them all. And then there are the 1v1 duels of the game. These are usually meant to highlight specific story moments, though there are a few out in the open world you can't encounter. But the duels are really all about testing your understanding of the stance system, as well as simply your ability to dodge and parry out of the way of more elaborate combos than the basic enemies tend to provide. Most of these are honestly pretty easy, especially if you've mastered the perfect parry, but nonetheless, just for coolness alone, I thought they were a lot of fun. Though I will say, for some reason, in the duels in particular, I had a little bit of trouble getting the dodge to work, which is not a problem I encountered out in the open world anywhere, but, something to note, I suppose. Then we have the stealth system. So you can, in fact, sneak around as Jin. This works like basically every other stealth system you've ever seen. You can hide in tall grass, which doesn't make a ton of sense, but there it is. And beyond that, it's pretty much just line of sight based. You can also upgrade a bunch of abilities to make your stealth approach to things much more deadly, like such as being able to chain assassinations up to 3 times to kill enemies very, very quickly. Much later on, you can earn the ability to one-shot even camp leaders who are typically not able to be one-shot via stealth, but once you get to that point, they can be, and this is actually called a slaughter in particular, which can activate a ghost stance mechanic, which allows you to effectively terrify the enemy and get a few free one-shot kills in, which is something you can also activate by simply killing a bunch of enemies without taking any damage at all, which is something I had a lot of fun with, though I will say in larger groups of enemies and even some of the game's more scripted battle scenes, not getting hit can be a bit more of a challenge when you're getting approached from all sides, basically. Now, beyond just that stuff, the fundamental core of the combat system is that you want to, of course, defend yourself by either blocking, parrying, dodging out of the way, and then following up with your own attacks to take out the enemy quickly. But this involves a few specific mechanics, and while most things can be blocked, a fair few things cannot, and these will usually flash that small red icon before enemies do these things, and you'll just dodge out of the way of those. And then any attack that lights up blue, instead, you have the potential to parry. Now, personally, I loved the parry window in this game. I felt it was very well timed. I got a really good hang of that. And if you perfectly parry an enemy, you'll stagger them, which opens them up to a bunch of free hits. And honestly, just being able to master that specific mechanic after a while made the entire game much, much easier, but also still really impactful, because you have to land those timings and then capitalize on their stunned state afterwards. Now, you also have light and heavy attacks. Light are pretty basic. Heavy attacks are, of course, slow, but they also chip away at the enemy's stance, or stagger meter, if you will. And once that fills up, it breaks them, and they'll be stunned and open them up to a bunch of free hits. Now, as you start taking out enemy Mongol leaders, you'll eventually start unlocking extra stances, which is important because each stance is specialized against a certain type of enemy. So you'll get a stance that works great against enemy with shields or the big brute enemies. And while these are not strictly speaking required for you to use, switching between them for specific enemy types can be pretty useful and is another way in which you can mix up combat a little bit. Now, some of my favorite things to do though were actually your ghost weapons. As your legend grows, you'll unlock the ability to use certain throwable items typically, such as sticky bombs, smoke bombs, kunai, or other things. Now, kunai were actually my favorite because you could throw them and it would immediately stagger several enemies in a row, and with a few upgrades you could throw like 5 or 6 at once. But even stuff like the smoke bomb will obscure you and allow you to assassinate enemies in your immediate range. And that's to say nothing, of course, of your ranged weapon options, such as the half-bow or longbow you can get access to, which are just a ton of fun to mess around with as well. As if your aim is pretty solid, you can one-shot enemies before they even get close to you, which I imagine is a bit easier on PC in particular compared to consoles. So all of that to tell you that combat is surprisingly robust and a ton of fun to mess around with. I think it manages to do a lot of different things without becoming overwhelming or being so simple that it just isn't engaging at all. It really does manage to find that sort of sweet spot between those two things, and for an action adventure, I think that's wonderful. I really did enjoy the combat system from start to finish, which was great to see. Now, moving a bit on with the DLC section of the game. So, if you bought the game on PC, you own the DLC, as the PC version is the Director's Cut, which comes with the Iki Island DLC. A ways into the game, you'll get access to a side mission that allows you to go to the nearby Iki Island, which is dealing with a very specific tribe of Mongols known as the Eagle tribe. They are using some sort of hallucinogen to drive people crazy, and you obviously want to put a stop to that, but the problem is, Iki Island was last visited by your own father, who tore the place apart while he was there, and essentially your clan and family in particular are not welcome there. So not only do you have to fight the Mongols, but also people's opinions of you and your father. So the game kind of dives into your own past there. And overall, I would say honestly, it's just not as strong as the main game, but I did like a lot of the rewards that come specifically from that DLC, and it introduces a few new activities you can mess around with that were also decently fun. I would say the real highlight for me though was the horse armor, which I thought attaching to the game via a DLC was exceptionally hilarious. But overall, I don't think the DLC is as strong as the main game. But if you liked the base game, you'll likely enjoy the DLC as well. Which brings me to the Steam Deck section. Now, the Steam Deck for Ghost of Tsushima here is especially interesting to me because officially the game has a rating of not supported. And this is actually because it's a Linux-based system and the game has a multiplayer mode, and the PlayStation Network specifically requires Windows to operate, which means that the PlayStation Network and thus the multiplayer mode are simply not available on the Steam Deck, which I personally don't care that much about, especially since beyond that, the game actually runs incredibly well on the Steam Deck, like shockingly so. I was surprised at how well it ran. The really only issue I would say you'd have playing this on the Steam Deck in particular is that the battery life is pretty bad. Like it's probably going to be like 2 hours tops for you. This game did in fact just chew through the Steam Deck's battery, but otherwise was a surprisingly enjoyable experience. It's got cloud saves, controller support obviously. The default graphical settings for the Steam Deck are fantastic. Genuinely no complaints on that front. If anything, I was surprised at how well it worked. Which brings me to the positives and negatives before we wrap this thing up. So on the positive side of things, I loved the story of this game. I didn't talk about it much here for the sake of spoilers, but honestly, incredible story. I didn't know what to do with myself after it ended, and the ending itself is wonderful. Can't say enough good things about it. Then there's the actual atmosphere of the game, the visuals, of course, but also the dive into Japanese culture and what honor means to each of these individuals all really add something to the game, both in terms of its presentation and what all of those things add to the story and sort of overall ambiance, if you will. The game really nails those particular things. But also, I just had a blast with the combat of this game. I think action adventures in particular don't tend to be especially noteworthy in this particular aspect usually, but I honestly had a blast cutting my way through enemies via all the various tools that they make available to you, and there was enough of a skill ceiling that it was engaging all the way through. I had a blast with the combat of this one, which also surprised me a fair bit. But nonetheless, there are a few negatives. So I would say the main ones for me are the fact that once you get past the presentation of the open world, it is kind of just a traditional checklist open world. And if you're actually trying to do everything, I think that can get a bit stale. It's likely not going to bother you if you're simply running through the story and that's enough for you, but it's almost certainly going to get pretty repetitive if you try to do much beyond that. And then there is the combat camera. Oftentimes you're going to be running in and out of buildings and around certain areas, and there's oftentimes going to be big battles taking place, and the camera just can't seem to keep up with a lot of this stuff. There were plenty of times where I was hit by things I quite literally never saw coming, and it definitely got pretty frustrating, frankly. And that brings me to my conclusion. So, Ghost of Tsushima is, in a lot of ways, a beautiful coat of paint on very tried and true systems. The story and the atmosphere are incredible. I loved that stuff. So much so that even if you don't like the more repetitive nature of that traditional open world that is hiding underneath all of the stylistic choices, I still think the game would be worth it to simply blast through the story and enjoy what that has to offer. That's how much I loved it. So while I wouldn't personally consider this game particularly groundbreaking in anything it does, it is still a very good game. The story is exceptional, and I would recommend this game purely based on that alone. And for the game's base price of $60, which again, I did pay, no review copy or anything like that on this one for me, nor was one expected as this is a PC channel, but I absolutely feel like I got my money's worth out of it, so it's a very easy buy out of me. Which is where I'm going to wrap up this particular review. So I certainly hope you enjoyed it, hope you found it interesting, gave you some information about the game. If so, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. Do in fact let me know what you think of this one down in the comment section below. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.